In April of 1940, in issue number 38 of Detective Comics, a new character was introduced. This was to be a helper to the main character of the book. This, of course, was Robin, the Boy Wonder, who became the assistant to the Batman. Over the years, though, Robin became more than just a sidekick and helper. He became a friend and valuable ally. For the next 6 weeks, we're going to be looking at sidekicks in the Bible. People who you may not have heard of, but became valuable helpers and valuable allies to some of the Bible's figures who are more prominent. So, let's get started on this week's lesson. Hello, welcome to this week's lesson on Mr. Vermeer's class. I am Brian Vermeer, and for the next few weeks we're going to be looking at biblical sidekicks. And before we begin, I'd just like to remind you to press that like button, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and be sure and follow me on Facebook and support Mr. Vermeer's class on Patreon. So, a couple of years ago, my daughter, who is an aspiring actress, went to go to an audition to try out for a play. Now, she had been in a couple of high school plays, and she had actually had some fairly large roles in these plays, and she thought she was a very good actress. So when she went to this audition for a community children's theater, she figured she'd be getting, one of the better roles in the play. And she, of course, was going to be trying out for, the lead role in the play. Well, when I went to pick her up after the audition, she came to the car in tears. And I asked her, "What part did you get?" And she said, "I didn't get any part, I got ensemble." And ensemble means, you are one of the backup performers who would end up having to play very minor roles in the background or just to be someone. It's almost like an extra in a movie. And she said, "Not only that, but for part of it, I've got to wear a monkey suit." And we don't mean a tuxedo. She meant she actually had to wear a costume to look like a monkey. Well, I tried to, calm her down, and I tried to tell her, I said, well, what you do when this happens is you take that ensemble part and you play that ensemble part the absolute best that you can do. And that way, maybe this director will see you and see how well you perform in that ensemble part, and next time that director may think, she really deserves a higher role than that. And my daughter has taken that advice to heart. Every time she's performed since then, she goes out and she tries her absolute best and hopes that one day she will become the star of a production. We're going to be looking at some people in the Bible who you may not have heard of because they play backup roles. They are people who helped out the main characters, and I really don't like to use that word characters because that implies, a fictional account. But, every big hero has to have someone who helps him out. George Washington did not win the Revolutionary War by himself. He had plenty of soldiers and plenty of advisors helping him out to do this. Well, we're going to be looking at biblical people and some of their helpers and assistants. Today we're going to be in the book of Exodus. We're going to start off in chapter 17, and we're going to look at some helpers that Moses had as he led the Israelites out of Egypt. So let's start in Exodus chapter 17, looking at verses 8 through 10. It says, "At Rephidim, Amalek came and fought against Israel. Moses said to Joshua, 'Select some men for us and go fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the hilltop with God's staff in my hand.' Joshua did as Moses told him and fought against Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill." Now, The first name we get here is Joshua. Joshua is not the one that we're going to be looking at. Most of you have probably heard of Joshua. Joshua was the commander of Moses' army during the Exodus, and Joshua, of course, would later go on and be the one to succeed Moses as the leader, and he would be the one who would lead Israel in the conquering of the Promised Land. He's not the man we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at these two others, Aaron and Hur. But let's start off here in verse 8. It says, at Rephidim, Amalek came and fought against Israel. Well, who is Amalek, or what is Amalek? Amalek was a nation that despised Israel. And why did they despise Israel? Well, if you look in Genesis chapter 36, verse 12, you see that Amalek, the man Amalek, was actually a grandson of Esau. So with the Israelites being the descendants of Jacob and the Amalekites being the descendants of Esau, you can see why the nation of Amalek would have a problem with the nation of Israel. So Amalek is coming down and fighting Israel. They haven't even really gotten out of Egypt yet. They've left Egypt, they've crossed the Red Sea, and they're on their way to Mount Sinai. But before they even get that far, they're being attacked by the Amalekites. So Moses tells Joshua, the commander of his army, you go select some men, you go draft an army, and you go fight against the Amalekites. And he says, tomorrow I'm going to go stand on the hilltop with God's staff in my hand. In other words, during this battle, I'm going to go up to the top of that hill where all of Israel can see me, and I'm going to be holding up God's staff. Now, this is the staff that Moses used to turn the Nile River into blood. This is the staff that Moses used to part the Red Sea. You know, this is the staff that God has been using to perform miracles through Moses. So to the people of Israel, this staff is a pretty big thing. I guess it's just kind of a moral thing. As long as we can see Moses up there holding his staff, then it's going to keep their morale up, and they're going to fight hard and he'll hopefully win this battle. So it said Joshua did as Moses told him, and he fought against Amalek. He took his army and he went out to fight. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur go to the top of the hill. Well, who are Aaron and Hur? Well, Aaron, you've probably heard of. Aaron is Moses' older brother. And he, of course, would later go on and become the first high priest. And the descendants of Aaron would become the priests of Israel. And the direct descendants of Aaron would be the high priests. So we know who he is. Who is Hur? You may never have heard of Hur before. And Hur is only mentioned in the Bible really in this account. But according to the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who was commissioned by the Romans in the first century to write a history of the Jewish people, he wrote this book called Antiquities of the Jews, and in this book we learn a lot about the history of Israel that's not necessarily written in the Bible. And in Book 3, Chapter 2, verse 54 of Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus says that Hur was the husband of Moses' sister Miriam. So that would make Hur Moses' brother-in-law. So here we see Moses going up on top of the hill with two people, his brother and his brother-in-law. So these are probably the two men who are closest to Moses family-wise. Well, what are they going to do when they get to the top of the hill? Let's look at the second account here. Let's continue on. Verses 11 to 13 of Exodus chapter 17. It says, while Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But whenever he put his hand down, Amalek prevailed. When Moses' hands grew heavy, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat down on it. Then Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other, so that his hands remained steady until the sun went down. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his army with the sword. So what do we see going on here? Moses goes up on top of the hill, and he's holding up the staff of God. He's holding up this staff that he's performed miracles with, This staff that Israel, believes has these, supernatural powers that God can use, to perform miracles to help Israel. And it says, as long as he held his hands up and held up this staff, Israel would be winning the battle. Again, we don't know whether this is just a, miraculous thing that God is doing, or maybe it's just a morale thing on behalf of Israel. As long as they can see Moses up there holding up the staff, then they know that God is on their side, and they know that they're going to win this battle, and they fight harder. But Moses, like any person, he gets tired. Try holding your hands up over your head for a long period of time, especially if you're holding something in them. It becomes very tiring very quickly. So Moses would have to lower his hands, probably to get the feeling back in his arms, just to rest his hands a little bit. And when they did, and Israel looked up and they saw he had his hands and the staff, lowered, they may have thought, well, God is not on our side now. Moses isn't holding the staff up, so maybe God's not for us. And that would get them down a little bit, and they wouldn't fight as hard. It could be that, or it could be, a miraculous intervention of God. As long as Moses held up the staff, then God would assist, Israel in this fight. We're not sure exactly all the details of that. All we know is when Moses held up the staff, the Israelites would win the battle. When he lowered his hands and lowered the staff, they would start losing the battle. Well, Aaron and Hur, of course, noticed this as well. So they decide, we've got to help out Moses. We've got to help out our brother Moses. So it says they took a stone and they put it under him so Moses could sit down to start with. And then it says Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other. So Aaron holds up one arm of Moses, Hur holds up the other arm of Moses. And they stand there and they hold Moses' arms up until the battle is over. It says here, until the sun went down. So this was an all-day battle. And it says because of that, Joshua was able to defeat the Amalekites. Now, one thing we really need to notice here. Aaron and Hur did not take Moses' staff and hold it up for him. They did not say, hey Moses, give me your staff and I will hold it up. Why did they not do that? Because they knew that the leadership of the Israelites was Moses' calling. And you might say this was Moses' burden. And they did not take Moses' burden or Moses' calling away from him. There are times when we might become jealous because we see somebody doing great things for God, especially if that someone is a close friend of ours or, someone that we know, and we see them, really succeeding and doing these great things for God, and all we're doing is helping out. And it might make us a little bit jealous. Why can't I be the star of the show? Why can't I be the one who God uses to, do all these great things? Well, let me tell you something. If you are helping in any way in somebody else's ministry, and if that's what God has called you to do, to be a helper, then that's what you need to be doing. Don't take their calling away from them. Don't be jealous because you think they are better than you. We've talked about this on several occasions. The body of Christ is made up of many parts. Some parts may not seem as important as others. You may not be called to be a head. You may be called to be an appendix. But that's an important part. You need to do what God calls you to do. Jesus told Peter once, when you become old, you're going to stretch out your hands and someone's going to take you where you don't want to go. And it says this was a way that he said, he was describing how Peter was going to die. And when Peter heard that, it says in John 21 that he looked back and pointed at the Apostle John and said, "What about him?" And Jesus said, "Well, if I want him to live until I come again, what's that to you? You follow me." In other words, don't worry about what God has called other people to do. You do what God has called you to do. God did not call Aaron and Hur to hold up the staff. God called them to help Moses hold up the staff. The assistant is just as important as the leader, because the leader can't do things without the assistant. So don't become jealous because you think somebody else is getting all the glory. God should be the one getting the glory in any ministry. And if God calls you to just be an assistant, then be content with that. That's what Aaron and Hur did here. They didn't take the staff away from Moses. They helped Moses to hold up the staff. They assisted Moses with what Moses' job was. Let's look on now to a later passage and see another place where they helped out Moses. Let's skip ahead now to Exodus 24 and look at verses 13 to 15. It says, "So Moses arose with his assistant Joshua and went up to the mountain of God. He told the elders, 'Wait here for us until we return to you. Aaron and Hur are here with you. Whoever has a dispute should go to them.' When Moses went up the mountain, the cloud covered it." So here we see the Israelites have gotten to Mount Sinai. They've received the 10 Commandments. God came down in the cloud. We talked about this a few weeks ago. God came down in the cloud, and God spoke the 10 Commandments out loud to the Israelites. They all heard the voice of God speaking the 10 Commandments to them. And now God has called Moses to go up the mountain to receive the rest of the law. So Moses is going to go up the mountain, and he's going to be gone for 40 days. And it says he took Joshua with him. Remember, Joshua became Moses' second in command. But he took Joshua with him. And they went up the mountain. Joshua didn't go all the way up. He stopped part way up, and then Moses went up completely, to get the law. But what does Moses do? Moses delegates some authority here. And sometimes, as a leader, that's what, you have to do. Delegate your authority. Have other people help you. If you are in a position of leadership, if you do find yourself, in a position of leadership in a ministry, or even in any other everyday circumstance, don't be afraid to delegate some of your authority if you start to become overwhelmed with what it is you have to do. Other people are there to help you. So looking at this, from the other point of view here, Moses didn't try to do everything himself. Moses relied on his helpers. Moses didn't try to lead the Israelites into battle because that's not what his calling was. He wasn't a military strategist. That's what he had Joshua for. And Moses was told to go up the mountain and receive the law. Well, while he's doing that, he can't be the leader of the people, or at least he can't be the one who is down there to listen to their concerns, to listen to their problems, or just to be the person in charge. So he's got to leave somebody else in charge while he goes up to the top of the mountain. And who does he pick? He picks Aaron and Hur. He gives them this big responsibility. Why does he pick them? Well, first of all, again, they're his brothers. One's his brother and one's his brother-in-law. But maybe part of it is because in the battle against Amalek, they showed that he could trust them. They showed that they were willing to help. So Moses is now giving them a bigger role. Just like I told my daughter, I said, when you're given that ensemble part, when you're given that background role, you play that background role as good as you can. You perform it as well as you can, and then maybe later on, the director will say, for my next show, she did really well. I'm going to give her a bigger role. I may even make her the star. Do whatever God has called you to do, and do it the best that you can. If God has called you to be a leader, then be a leader, and be the best leader that you can be. But if God has called you to be a helper, to be an assistant, to be a sidekick, then be the best helper, assistant, or sidekick that you can be. The point of this lesson is, be content with whatever God has called you to do. Don't become jealous because you think somebody else has a more important job than you do. You do what God has called you to do, and you do it the absolute best that you can. And God will see that performance. And if you have done that job as well as you can, then God will recognize your hard work. And who knows, He might give you something more important later on. He might give you a bigger role later on, if that's what He feels you need to be doing. God has given all of us a calling. God has given all of us jobs to do in the ministry. We all have something we can do to help out our church, to help to preach the word, to help to lead people to Christ. Some are called to be pastors, some are called to be teachers, some are called just to be ushers, some are called just to be door greeters. But all of these jobs are important. I'm a teacher. That's what God told me to do. I'm not a pastor. I can speak. I can get up and preach. And by the way, if you're interested, I am available for speaking engagements. Just go to my Facebook page and contact me. But I'm not a pastor. I can't be a pastor. God has not called me to be a pastor. A pastor does more than just preach a sermon on Sunday morning. And that's not what God has called me to do. But I'm content with what God has called me to do. That's why I make these videos, because that's what I feel that He wants me to do. And you need to be doing what God has called you to do. Don't feel bad if you're not the star. The sidekick is just as important. Robin saved Batman's life many times. Aaron and Hur helped out Moses the best way they could. Of course, if you go on and read the rest of the story in Exodus 24 and 25, you find out that Aaron actually failed in this calling. But that happens. You do what God has called you to do. Next week, we're going to look at someone who was called to be a leader, but decided not to do that. And we'll see what happens to him. So, again, like, subscribe, follow the Facebook, and support me on Patreon. And I'll see you again next week.